The United States Treasury Secretary just said something in public that most people heard without understanding. It was a seemingly ordinary statement about currency valuations and global trade dynamics. Yet it contained a foundational truth that is about to restructure the entire global economy. This was not merely a passing observation, but a deliberate signal that the third great monetary transition in modern history has officially begun, and it carries catastrophic consequences for those who remain unprepared. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of what is unfolding right now, we must look backward before we can look forward, specifically returning to the monumental decisions made in the summer of 1944. As the Second World War was drawing to a close, delegates from 44 nations gathered in a secluded hotel in New Hampshire to establish the Bretton Woods system, a highly disciplined framework designed to bring order to a shattered global economy by anchoring the United States dollar to physical gold and pegging all other major currencies to the dollar. This created an era of unprecedented stability and trust, ensuring that fiat currency was not merely a political tool, but a representation of actual tangible wealth which allowed the global economy to rebuild itself on a foundation of solid purchasing power. However, this golden age of monetary discipline was not destined to last forever, as the sheer cost of domestic social programs and foreign wars eventually began to exhaust the gold reserves of the United States, forcing a desperate and monumental shift in policy. In August of 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally severed the foundational link between the dollar and gold, permanently dismantling the Bretton Woods system and plunging the entire planet into a grand, unmoored experiment with pure fiat currency. The moment that gold backing disappeared, the nominal value of money became entirely detached from its real purchasing power, unleashing a silent, relentless wave of inflation that has systematically hollowed out the middle class and transferred enormous wealth from savers to debtors over the past 5 decades. Most individuals look at their bank accounts today and believe that their money is safe, completely oblivious to the alarming reality that their purchasing power is actively being drained away by a system designed to depreciate the currency in order to service an insurmountable mountain of dollar-denominated debt. This brings us directly to the present day and the specific deliberate policy moves being orchestrated by the current administration, which can be broken down into 3 distinct, highly consequential actions that are accelerating this global monetary reset. The first move is the engineered, deliberate weakening of the United States dollar, a strategy reminiscent of the 1985 Plaza Accord, where major global powers colluded to depreciate the dollar to manipulate the terms of trade and stimulate export-driven growth at the expense of domestic purchasing power. When the Treasury intentionally weakens the dollar, it acts as a hidden regressive tax on every single citizen, meaning that $100,000 sitting safely in a traditional savings account is mathematically guaranteed to lose its real-world value, making cash the ultimate trap for the uninformed investor. The second move involves a sweeping wave of structural deregulation aimed at unleashing certain sectors of the domestic economy. But this deregulation is fundamentally asymmetric, heavily favoring massive institutional players while leaving everyday retail investors exposed to heightened systemic risks and unprecedented market volatility. The third policy move is the aggressive implementation of protective tariffs and the weaponization of global trade networks, which may sound beneficial in political speeches, but in reality disrupts established supply chains, drives up the cost of imported goods, and further accelerates the inflationary pressures that are crushing the consumer. Let me now explain how these abstract macroeconomic policies translate into real-world wealth destruction, because the mechanism of this transfer is entirely silent, operating through the steady, invisible erosion of purchasing power rather than a dramatic overnight crash that would alert the public to the danger. When you hold your wealth in a fiat currency that is being deliberately depreciated to manage an unpayable national debt, you are participating in a rigged game where the rules dictate that your labor and your savings will continually buy less real estate, less energy, less food, and fewer assets as time goes on. This is why conventional financial advice, which consistently preaches the safety of holding large cash reserves and relying on fixed income investments, is not just outdated but genuinely dangerous in the current environment, as it practically guarantees a catastrophic loss of real wealth over the coming decade. The global reaction to this deliberate devaluation of the dollar has been both swift and unprecedented, as foreign nations have recognized the alarming vulnerability of relying on a fiat currency managed by an increasingly indebted superpower and have begun taking drastic coordinated steps to protect their own economies. We are currently witnessing a massive historic wave of de-dollarization spearheaded by the BRICS nations, who are actively building alternative financial architectures such as the CIPS system to bypass the traditional SWIFT messaging network and settle international trade in their own local currencies. Simultaneously, global central banks are hoarding physical gold at a pace not seen since the height of the Cold War, aggressively swapping their dollar reserves for the ultimate historically proven store of value as they prepare for the inevitable fracturing of the dollar-centric global order. This massive accumulation of gold by the world's central banks is the most glaring, undeniable proof that a structural shift is underway, serving as a glaring warning signal to anyone paying attention that the era of unquestioned fiat supremacy is rapidly drawing to a close. As we look to the future, we must navigate two distinct, highly consequential scenarios for how this monetary reset will ultimately unfold. And your financial survival depends entirely on your ability to understand and prepare for both possibilities. The first possibility is a managed transition, a scenario where global policymakers successfully coordinate a gradual, controlled devaluation of fiat currencies over a period of many years, slowly inflating away the mountain of sovereign debt while attempting to maintain a fragile illusion of economic stability. In this managed scenario, the destruction of your wealth will be slow but absolutely mathematically certain, a steady drip of inflation that hollows out your purchasing power year after year while asset prices continue to rise in nominal terms, creating a deceptive mirage of prosperity for those who hold the right assets. The second possibility, however, is far more alarming, a disorderly crisis scenario where the sheer weight of structural imbalances, geopolitical conflicts, and collapsing confidence in the fiat system triggers a sudden, chaotic unwinding of global financial markets, leading to a catastrophic loss of purchasing power in a highly compressed time frame. If a disorderly reset occurs, the parallels to the 1971 Nixon shock will be unmistakable, but the magnitude of the fallout will be exponentially greater, as the entire globe is now interconnected through a hyper-leveraged, debt-based financial system that has absolutely no anchor to real physical value. In either scenario, generational wealth destruction is the default, guaranteed outcome for the unprepared masses who naively trust the system and remain parked in cash, while massive, unprecedented generational wealth creation awaits those who recognize the transition and position themselves strategically ahead of the herd. To ensure that you are among the minority who thrive during this period of foundational change, you must recognize and avoid three specific underappreciated risks that are currently functioning as silent traps for the average investor. The first risk is the illusion of nominal gains, the dangerous psychological trap of believing that your wealth is growing simply because the numerical balance of your investment portfolio is increasing, while completely failing to account for the fact that the currency those gains are measured in is rapidly losing its purchasing power. The second risk is systemic counterparty risk, the often ignored reality that when you hold digital assets, bank deposits, or complex financial derivatives, your wealth is entirely dependent on the solvency and integrity of institutional intermediaries that may face catastrophic failure during a disorderly monetary reset. The third risk is geopolitical confiscation and capital controls. The growing threat that desperate governments facing overwhelming debt burdens and sovereign crises will inevitably change the rules of the game by implementing restrictive measures, seizing assets, or dramatically altering tax codes to confiscate the wealth of their citizens. Now, let me address the precise actions you must take to neutralize these risks, outlining 3 corresponding structural opportunities that will allow you to navigate this crisis and emerge significantly wealthier on the other side. The first opportunity is to aggressively reallocate a portion of your portfolio into hard, tangible assets that cannot be printed, depreciated, or easily confiscated by government decree, utilizing historically proven stores of value like physical gold, prime real estate, and essential commodities to anchor your wealth in reality. The second opportunity lies in leveraging asymmetric, decentralized networks that exist outside the traditional fiat architecture, positioning a strategic percentage of your capital in robust, mathematically secure digital assets that offer true scarcity and immunity from the arbitrary monetary policies of central bankers. The third opportunity is the acquisition of cash-flowing productive businesses or high-quality equities that possess immense pricing power, meaning they provide essential goods or services and can easily pass the rising costs of inflation directly onto the consumer, thereby protecting your real returns regardless of how severely the currency depreciates. Let me emphasize that these are not merely speculative investment ideas, but rather a foundational, actionable framework designed to fundamentally restructure your relationship with money, transforming you from a passive victim of global macroeconomic currents into an active strategic architect of your own financial destiny. The United States Treasury has already shown its hand. The central banks of the world are already executing their defensive strategies, and the historical precedents of 1944, 1971, and 1985 provide absolute, irrefutable proof of what happens when a global monetary system undergoes a deliberate structural transformation. You can no longer afford to rely on the outdated financial advice of the past, because the economic reality that those strategies were built upon has permanently disappeared, replaced by a volatile, high-stakes environment where inaction is mathematically equivalent to catastrophic financial loss. The transition from a unipolar dollar-dominated fiat system to a multipolar asset-backed global economy is not a future theory to debate, but a present ongoing reality that is actively unfolding around you at this very moment, demanding immediate, decisive action. By understanding the historical context of Bretton Woods, recognizing the deliberate policy moves of the current administration, acknowledging the massive wave of de-dollarization, and preparing for both managed and disorderly future scenarios, you have equipped yourself with the insider clarity necessary to protect your family's future. The 3-step framework of acquiring hard assets, utilizing decentralized networks, and holding cash-flowing inflation-resistant equities provides a robust, impenetrable shield against the silent wealth erosion that is destined to wipe out the savings of the oblivious majority. You now possess the knowledge required to navigate this generational crisis, but knowledge alone is entirely insufficient without the courage to execute a strategic plan in the face of overwhelming global uncertainty and systemic deception. If you look closely at the mechanics of the 1985 Plaza Accord, you will see a perfect historical mirror reflecting the current administration's strategy to depreciate the dollar, an event where the finance ministers of the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City and agreed to fundamentally manipulate the currency markets to drive down the value of the dollar in order to correct massive trade imbalances. This deliberate depreciation caused the dollar to lose over 50% of its value against the Japanese yen and the German mark in just a few short years, a catastrophic loss of purchasing power for anyone holding dollar-denominated assets, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that governments will absolutely sacrifice the wealth of their citizens to achieve broader macroeconomic objectives. Today, we are witnessing an identical, though far more stealthy, campaign of currency debasement But this time it is not just a handful of developed nations coordinating the effort, but a massive fractured global economy where the BRICS nations are actively weaponizing the terms of trade to break the hegemony of the dollar once and for all. The implementation of the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, by foreign adversaries is not merely a technical upgrade to global banking, but a deliberate strategic dagger aimed directly at the heart of the SWIFT messaging network, designed to ensure that the United States can never again use its currency as a geopolitical weapon to sanction or freeze the dollar-denominated debt of competing sovereign nations. This structural shift away from SWIFT and toward CIPS means that the artificial global demand for dollars that has propped up American purchasing power for the last 50 years is permanently evaporating, which will inevitably result in trillions of dollars flooding back into the domestic economy, accelerating the vicious cycle of inflation and completely destroying the standard of living for anyone trapped in fixed income investments or traditional savings accounts. When you truly grasp the mechanics of this looming crisis, you realize that the concept of a safe asset has been entirely inverted. The fiat currency that your grandfather trusted as the bedrock of his financial security has been weaponized into an instrument of wealth confiscation, while the volatile, hard assets that conventional advisors dismiss as risky have become the only mathematical certainty for preserving purchasing power in a world drowning in unpayable debt. Consider the sheer scale of the sovereign debt burden currently suffocating the global economy, a staggering, incomprehensible mountain of obligations that can mathematically never be repaid in money that retains its current value, leaving governments with only two possible paths forward: outright catastrophic default, which would trigger a global depression and the collapse of the banking system, or the deliberate, systematic devaluation of the currency, which allows them to pay back their debts with money that is worth a fraction of its original purchasing power. History, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic to the tragic collapse of the Zimbabwean dollar, proves absolutely and unequivocally that politicians will always choose the path of inflation, choosing to secretly steal the wealth of their citizens through currency debasement rather than face the political suicide of massive tax hikes or the agonizing austerity of deep spending cuts. This is the exact mechanism by which your $100,000 savings account is being quietly drained. Not by a thief breaking into your home, but by the silent, insidious erosion of your money's ability to buy the essential goods, services, and energy required to sustain your life, turning your hard-earned capital into a melting ice cube that is disappearing right before your eyes. The only rational, logical response to this deliberate campaign of financial repression is to radically and permanently restructure your entire philosophy of wealth, abandoning the comforting but lethal illusions of the fiat system and embracing the undeniable historical reality that true wealth can only be stored in assets that require genuine human labor, scarce natural resources, or complex cryptographic energy to produce. Let us delve deeper into the specific, actionable framework required to protect yourself, beginning with a comprehensive understanding of the first great opportunity: the strategic accumulation of physical gold and precious metals, an asset class that has outlived every single fiat currency ever created by humanity and remains the only financial asset on Earth that is not simultaneously someone else's liability. When central banks around the world, the very institutions responsible for printing fiat currency, are aggressively dumping their own paper money to stockpile thousands of tons of physical gold, it is the ultimate, undeniable signal that the architects of the system are preparing for its inevitable collapse, and you must follow their actions rather than their words if you want to survive the coming monetary reset. The second opportunity in this structural transition requires you to look beyond traditional analog assets and recognize the foundational shift occurring in the digital realm, where decentralized cryptographic networks have engineered a new form of absolute mathematical scarcity that operates completely outside the jurisdiction, manipulation, and control of any central bank or government entity. By allocating a carefully calculated portion of your portfolio to these robust digital assets, you are essentially buying an insurance policy against the catastrophic failure of the fiat monetary system, securing a foothold in a parallel financial architecture that cannot be inflated, debased, or easily confiscated by desperate politicians seeking to plug the gaping holes in their insolvent budgets. The third opportunity demands a fundamental shift in how you evaluate and invest in the traditional equities market, moving entirely away from speculative, growth-oriented companies that rely on cheap debt and endless monetary stimulus, and pivoting aggressively toward high-quality, cash-flowing enterprises that control critical infrastructure, produce essential commodities, or dominate the global supply chains of indispensable resources. These inflation-resistant equities possess the ultimate superpower in a depreciating currency environment: immense pricing power, which allows them to seamlessly pass the rising costs of raw materials, labor, and energy directly onto their customers, ensuring that their profit margins, and consequently your investment returns, continue to grow in real, inflation-adjusted terms, regardless of how much fiat money the central banks print. Navigating this treacherous landscape requires immense discipline, psychological resilience, and a steadfast refusal to be swayed by the comforting lies and manufactured narratives pushed by mainstream financial media, which exist solely to keep the oblivious masses pacified and fully invested in the very system that is actively stripping away their wealth. You must accept the uncomfortable reality that the rules of the game are rigged against the ordinary saver, that the global monetary reset is not a fringe conspiracy theory, but a documented, ongoing macroeconomic transition, and that your financial survival depends entirely on your ability to recognize the historical parallels between 1944, 1971, and the unprecedented events unfolding today. The destruction of the middle class is not an accident, but a mathematical certainty embedded in the very design of a debt-based fiat currency system. A deliberate transfer of wealth from those who work and save to those who print and borrow, and the only way to avoid becoming collateral damage in this grand economic experiment is to take absolute, uncompromising control of your own capital. As you implement this three-step framework of hard assets, decentralized networks, and inflation-resistant equities, you will begin to experience a profound sense of clarity and empowerment, realizing that the same systemic forces that are guaranteed to destroy the wealth of the unprepared can be harnessed and redirected to build massive asymmetric generational wealth for your family. To truly internalize the severity of the geopolitical confiscation and capital controls risk, you must examine the historical track record of desperate governments facing sovereign debt crises, where the immediate reflexive response is always to lock down the financial system, freeze bank accounts, and trap the wealth of citizens within the collapsing currency to prevent capital flight. We saw this exact scenario play out with devastating precision during the banking crises in Cyprus and Greece, where ordinary depositors woke up to find their life savings arbitrarily haircut or completely inaccessible, proving that the money you deposit in a traditional banking institution is no longer legally yours, but rather an unsecured loan to a hyper-leveraged entity that owes its primary allegiance to the state. This is why the concept of counterparty risk is not merely an abstract financial theory, but a terrifying, imminent threat to your livelihood, because in a disorderly reset scenario, the complex web of financial derivatives and interconnected institutional liabilities will inevitably unravel, triggering a cascading chain of defaults that will instantly wipe out trillions of dollars of paper wealth that exists only as digital entries on a centralized ledger. To shield yourself from this catastrophic vulnerability, you must systematically eliminate counterparty risk from your financial life, taking physical possession of your precious metals, securing your own private keys for your digital assets, and holding direct registered ownership of your high-quality equities. ensuring that no bank, no broker, and no government agency stands between you and your hard-earned wealth. Furthermore, we must deeply analyze the profound implications of the BRICS nations expanding their membership and aggressively consolidating their control over the world's essential commodities, an unprecedented geopolitical maneuver that is fundamentally shifting the global balance of power away from the financialized, debt-driven economies of the West and toward the resource-rich, productive economies of the East. By dominating the global supply of oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, and agricultural fertilizers, this emerging multipolar coalition possesses the ultimate leverage to dictate the terms of global trade, allowing them to systematically demand payment in their own local currencies or physical gold, thereby completely bypassing the dollar and accelerating the demise of its exorbitant privilege. This structural realignment of global commodity markets is the precise mechanism that will trigger the massive inflationary boomerang effect, sending trillions of unwanted, depreciated dollars flooding back into the United States economy, chasing a shrinking supply of real goods and services, and unleashing an inflationary firestorm that will make the economic turmoil of the 1970s look like a period of relative tranquility. When you understand this inescapable macroeconomic reality, the strategy of holding fixed income investments like government bonds becomes glaringly irrational, as you are essentially locking up your capital for a decade or more in exchange for a nominal yield that is mathematically guaranteed to be vastly inferior to the true real-world rate of inflation, guaranteeing a massive, catastrophic loss of purchasing power. The deliberate structural deregulation currently being championed by the administration is specifically designed to mask this underlying economic rot, creating a temporary artificial boom in certain highly concentrated sectors of the stock market, enriching massive institutional insiders while luring retail investors into a dangerous, overvalued trap just before the inevitable systemic repricing of all fiat-denominated assets. This is the very definition of a rigged game, a grand illusion engineered by the Treasury and the central banks to keep the oblivious masses confidently invested in the very system that is actively orchestrating their financial demise, ensuring that the necessary liquidity is always available for the elite to quietly exit their positions and rotate their capital into hard, tangible, historically proven stores of value. Every single day that you hesitate to restructure your portfolio, you are actively choosing to participate in this silent wealth transfer, willingly sacrificing the purchasing power of your labor to fund the unpayable debts of a bloated, insolvent government that has demonstrated time and time again that it views the savings of its citizens as nothing more than a convenient, expendable resource to be sacrificed on the altar of macroeconomic expediency. You must reject this paradigm completely, recognizing that the responsibility for your financial survival rests squarely and exclusively on your own shoulders, and that relying on the government, traditional financial advisors, or the mainstream media for salvation is a guaranteed path to generational poverty in the unforgiving, hard asset-backed economy of the future. The roadmap to navigating this crisis is abundantly clear, written in the historical precedents of Bretton Woods and the Plaza Accord, telegraphed by the massive gold accumulation of global central banks, and dictated by the immutable laws of mathematics and economics. You must escape the fiat trap, neutralize your counterparty risk, and boldly position your capital in the scarce, tangible, and productive assets that will define the next century of global wealth. The transition will be volatile, the headlines will be terrifying, and the systemic deceptions will be relentless. But armed with this structural, actionable framework and the unshakable clarity of historical perspective, you possess the power to not only survive the coming storm, but to harness its immense destructive energy to forge an unshakable financial fortress for yourself and your posterity. The global monetary reset has definitively begun. The foundational pillars of the old fiat system are crumbling before our very eyes, and the vast, undeniable wealth transfer of the 21st century is already accelerating at a breathtaking pace. demanding that you immediately abandon the dangerous trap of conventional financial advice and execute this actionable framework with absolute conviction. The time between understanding and acting is the only variable that remains within your control.